debate. We're looking at the fallout from the end of a 32-hour siege, a alleged killer in the southwestern city of Toulouse, who died in a hail of bullets. He had been holed up in a ground floor apartment after he had allegedly been the one who had taken out three French soldiers, a fourth in critical condition, and three Jewish school children, as well as one of their teachers, over a period of a week. With us to talk about it from the UK capital, Brooke Rogers, who studies the psychology of violent radicalization at King's College London, James Cohen, who teaches all about immigration integration studies here in Paris at the Sorbonne Nouvelle University, otherwise known as Paris 3, because all universities have campuses of different numbers. And Eric Olender, France 24 digital media editor, who's back with us. Welcome back to all of you. Let's hear the reaction in terms of could more have been done from the French foreign minister, Alain Juppé. He was interviewed this morning on Breakfast Radio.
The man behind these monstrous attacks was recently questioned by intelligence services. I understand that you could ask if that constitutes an intelligence failure. I don't know if there was a failure of some kind, and we need clarity about that.
Brooke Rogers, obviously you're not privy to the notes of the state prosecutor, but do you feel as though perhaps authorities dropped the ball?
I think it's ever so difficult to collect the information across various intelligence agencies and policing agencies and to actually connect the dots because they need to balance the protection of human rights in the first place, and they also need to follow so many people, so they're spread quite thin on the ground. So I wouldn't go so far as to say they dropped the ball. He was clearly on their radar. I just think that it's very difficult to identify when somebody who's a young man and involved in lower levels of criminality and lower levels of violence is clearly going to take that final step towards the acts that we've seen over the past few days. So I think it's a combination of a failure to connect the dots between organizations, but that's very, very difficult to do in just about any country. The claim, it was posted on one of these jihadist websites, a group calling itself Jund al-Khilafa, which is claiming responsibility for the Jewish school shooting. It's always difficult for us to figure this out. Was he part, after having, again, made 2 trips to Afghanistan, was he part of Al-Qaeda Incorporated, or was he somebody who was just inspired by Al-Qaeda? The nature of recruitment and the nature of the cell structures that we're seeing for the Islamist AQ-style cells has changed greatly, and it's moved from more of a hierarchical structure to more of a guided cell structure. So we still do have information coming from those at the top, but there are opportunities for individuals to be quite self-motivated, groups to be self-motivated, to find their own personal link to jihad if they are keen on doing so. The internet's already been mentioned as one of the tools. So I do believe that he had information coming down, but the benefit of having this guided cell structure is that individuals and groups can undertake acts of terrorism, and if they're not successful, the groups who potentially gave them some ideas, maybe a little bit of guidance, maybe a little bit of funding, can step away from it, and they don't need to claim responsibility. Whereas if an attack is successful, they can step up to the plate and say, we did that.
All right, and on the France 24 Debate Facebook page, we asked you what you thought that made the alleged killer snap. A few reactions. Muffins Man says he was a crazy radical Islamist with links to Al-Qaeda. Does one really need any more explanation? While Daniel from Revolt in Israel says the only possible explanation one can find is that he's a dangerous psychopath. He's no more a Muslim than other psycho killers are Jewish or Christian. And that gets back to what you interjected when Eric was speaking in part 1. The question that Eric raised of what people have been saying on the web, was he really French? And you said, of course he was French.
And of course, he was Muslim in the sense that he was, like so many Muslims in French, more of a passive practitioner of the religion and not really much of a religious fanatic, except insofar as he did become motivated at some point, from what I gather, by the idea that there is a worldwide Islamic community that needs to be galvanized all together as a monolith, as it were, and he got that into his head. Trips to Afghanistan and Pakistan must have helped to cement that idea in his head. Clearly, what's important in France today is to dissociate that sort of path that he took, which is a rather rare one, 0.0 something percent, from Islam in general. And the problem is that today, in today's atmosphere, in today's political atmosphere in France, there's so much suspicion of Islam in general that it gets difficult to really distinguish between Islam in general and this politicized radicalism, which is actually a very schematic kind of politics as well. It's not really very well thought out. But
why is there that suspicion?
I wish I know. You could ask the Minister of the Interior himself, Claude Guéant. Maybe he can tell you better than I can why these things get mixed up in the heads of politicians.
Well, that was one of the points brought up yesterday by one of the centrist candidates, Bayrou, who accused the National Front, the far-right Conservative Party, for kind of laying the groundwork for this type of isolation in the culture that exists in terms of alienating people. That really was the first shot in how this crisis yesterday transformed from a security crisis into a political event as well. And the politicians then have started to maneuver themselves around the issue with a little bit of delicacy, because it was a very sensitive time in terms of what they could say and what they couldn't say. And that's, again, there was the concern that social media and the internet and the news culture that's existing, a very new news culture here. Again, this is one of the first crises that's existed in France with a 24-hour news channel, BFM and these other channels that were on this all the time, including France 24. And that really changed the dynamic of it. Information was coming out that wasn't always accurate, the role of social networks and whatnot, and then the politicians being concerned that they were going to be defined both by the issue and by, of course, the social media around it.
And criticisms popped up against the headline in the conservative newspaper Le Figaro this Thursday. Is splashed across the front page. Mohamed Merah, 23 years old, Islamist terrorist. And a lot of the viewers pointing out that, Brooke Rogers, that when it was the case of Mr. Breivik in Norway, he was a killer. In this case, he is a terrorist. I noticed that you've been using the word terrorist throughout the discussion. It is a loaded term.
It is a highly loaded term, socially and politically. I think that I'd like to address the issue of his mental health because there is evidence from so many different interactions and case studies that these individuals are sane individuals. In fact, they're very, very sane individuals. They are not crazy. And in terms of becoming terrorists, I believe that we have actually given power to the messages coming out from the Islamist group through our media responses, through our political responses, by labeling them as terrorist acts as well. He is a murderer. He killed many people. He had believed that he had clear group affiliations, and that group has been labeled as a terrorist group. If you look at some of the other issues, sometimes it's more difficult to actually link them to specific groups, especially if the groups do not claim ownership of that individual or responsibility for their actions.
James Cohen, your thoughts?
I was just going to say that I think we do need to pay attention to labels, and one label that concerns me is the term Islamist or Islamiste in French, because what does it mean after all? It can refer indifferently to all kinds of different things. It can refer to people who win elections in Tunisia or in Egypt. It can refer to people who are very pious and who dress up that way. But it can also refer to this very small number of individuals who go off on a violent path. So Islamiste is a term to be questioned.
But is it not a separation as saying it's other? It's not us. If it was a white Christian French person, as we saw in Norway, in terms of would they have reacted that way, Le Figaro, in that way? But I get the sense sometimes that there's...
They did not.
There's a natural...
They did not.
Well,
there's this idea saying, that's not our society, that's not us.
Yes. There's a distressing and very strong tendency in French society today. I hate to generalize, but you see it almost everywhere. Largely on the political right and the far right, and they tend to resemble each other these days in that respect. But in sectors of the left as well, you get this idea that Islam in itself is something suspect, because it's assumed that what we just saw in Toulouse grows out of Islam in general. That's a problem. That's a big problem.
And of course, France isn't unique in that. That's also a tendency in the United States as well.
It's also the case, yeah.
Earlier in the conversation, Brooke Rogers was mentioning the issue of if you monitor people too closely, come to the free speech issues. Nicolas Sarkozy Making a formal statement from the French presidential palace earlier in the day, he vowed to crack down on those who visit jihadist websites.
From now on, anyone who regularly consults websites that praise terrorism or call for hatred and violence will be criminally punished. Anyone going abroad to undergo indoctrination courses in ideologies leading to terrorism will be legally punished.
Eric Older?
Well, this is actually consistent with Sarkozy's other positions on the net. For example,
are there books on the law? Laws on the books.
The 2006 Security Anti-Terrorism Law does give the authorities wide latitude to intervene into the digital networks. But from Sarkozy's point of view and his kind of worldview, remember, he has taken the lead in the anti-piracy campaign with the Adopi law, which is very interventionist. Allowing the government to monitor if you're downloading illegal content. So this is very much consistent with Sarkozy's thinking and his worldview on terms of the role of the government and policing the web.
Brooke Rogers, you who advises the police in the UK, where do you draw the line?
I would say that I lecture on the courses that they attend in order to learn more about this topic. I would say that if you start banning individuals who are looking at terrorist or websites that support terrorist ideology on the web, then I will probably need to go to prison because I do that for my research. And it's very, very difficult to shut down the sites if they are putting forth illegal ideology or propaganda because they'll spring up elsewhere. They're quite often hosted in another country. But I do not think that you can control all of the sites that people are looking at unless you find a way to control the sites and stop them popping up in the first place. As a member of the public, you have the right to look at that type of information if it has not been banned formally by the government at that point.
And has it changed the agenda on this campaign trail? Well, the answer is definitely. Has it pushed the momentum in favor of the incumbents, since law and order, the fight against terrorism is often perceived in this country as a right-wing issue? Well, yes and no. A poll conducted just this past Monday and Tuesday puts Nicolas Sarkozy clearly in front for the first time in the first round of the presidential election, but it's also concomitant with the elimination of minor right-wing candidates from the final ballot list. And in the second round, he makes up no ground whatsoever on his main rival, the socialist François Hollande, still with what's often a 10-point advantage over the incumbent François Hollande, doing his best to appear presidential.
France is still the strongest. It has shown as much. We know how to stand up against our worst enemies without losing sight of our fundamental values.
Losing sight of our essential values. It's a hard one for the opposition leader to navigate.
He was probably in the most difficult position throughout this whole crisis, because if he was too aggressive in criticizing the operations of either the police or the Sarkozy administration, he would have been labeled profiteering from this misery. If he stood back, again, what I mentioned earlier, he also risks having the issues define him and coming off weak. So he had by far the finest line to tread on this.
All right, and one of the criticisms leveled against Hollande is that he lacks a bit of bite, especially in dealing with the far right. On Wednesday, its leader Marine Le Pen said risks of political and religious fundamentalism had been underestimated in France. On Thursday, she went further, accusing the government of surrendering poor suburbs to Islamist radicals. While Hollande so far refused to be drawn on the subject, his competition to the far left has been speaking up.
She's pathetic as usual. She only knows how to do one thing. Apparently there wasn't enough hatred for her, so she added a bit more. The only thing she knows how to do is bark and show her teeth and froth with rage.
James Cohen, you're telling us to pay attention to rhetoric that's inflammatory, that's misleading, that's plain wrong. Which strategy is better when somebody from the far right makes remarks like this? Is it the ignore it strategy of Hollande or the lean into her strategy of the far left?
I think that Mélenchon, it's difficult for me to be impartial about this, but in the past few weeks, he's shown himself to be just about the only politician that's been around in France for a long time that was able to shut the mouth of Marine Le Pen and cow her and intimidate her by being as forthright as she, but more accurate on the issues. She's clearly instrumentalizing the tragedy that's just occurred by making it look as if we've been telling you all along, we of the National Front have been telling you all along that there's a security issue linked to Islamism, and the government itself is soft on it, and the left even softer. That's simply politicizing and instrumentalizing the issue, and I think that Mélenchon is right to go after her for that, and he's in a more comfortable position to do so because he's not the front runner, and he doesn't have that big a risk.
Brooke Rogers, in the UK, where there's a growing far right, what's the best strategy in dealing with remarks that are inflammatory?
Well, I do think that we need to create a platform where debates can be held. I do know that through my engagement with a variety of organizations internationally, that the concerns over the threat of the far-right organizations and the far-right rhetoric have never decreased, and they have not gone away in spite of our increase in publicity and conversations about the Islamist threat. So the far-right concerns and threat just have been running along business as usual on that end. So I think it's very difficult to separate the two. The Islamist threat and the far-right threat both create a situation that can threaten members of the public. And we need to actually have a platform for dialogue, but there do need to be rules around that dialogue in terms of inciting hatred and racism and supporting violence.
All right, 31 days to go. Eric Olner, we're almost out of time. Are we going to be going back to discussing about the economy on this set, or is it going to be all about these issues from here on in?
I think security and terrorism in Islam will be very prominent strains. The economy, of course, is still going to be a paramount issue, but no doubt security is now on the table.
All right, the prediction there from Eric Olner. Thanks for that. I want to thank as well James Cohen for joining us, and Brooke Rogers for being with us from London here in the France 24 debate. Coverage continues of the situation in Toulouse on France 24. And by the way, in just a few minutes, right here, we're going to have a Google Plus Hangout. Eric posting that, the address there, gplus.to/Olander, if you want to join the conversation here right after the debate.